In this video, we're going to take what we've learned so far in After Effects and start using 3D space. So far, everything we've made in After Effects has been two-dimensional. What is visible and what is obscured has been based on the layer order. However, we can place things within a 3D environment and use depth. Layer order becomes irrelevant, and what is obscured is entirely based on how far back in a scene an object is. This allows us to also use lighting and shadow, as well as camera techniques such as depth of field to create much more dynamic and visually rich compositions. So enough said, let's get started. So here I've created an animation of my tidy man throwing a piece of rubbish into a bin. This is just a simple character animation, similar to the one where we made him walk in a previous video. We're going to place this within a 3D space so we can use shadow and depth of field to make this a bit more dynamic and interesting visually. I'm going to start, however, by looking at all the layers. Now the layers so far are exactly as we expect. What is above obscures what is below. There are also quite a lot of layers to work with. So to keep things straightforward, we're going to compartmentalize what we have into a precomposition. To do this, select all the layers we want to place within the same composition, Control-click on them, and you'll find an option, Precompose. We can give it a name, and click OK. We're now still within the same original composition, but all those elements are now compartmentalized. If I double-click on it, it'll open that pre-comp, and if I made any changes such as hiding elements and go back to my main composition, that will obviously be carried across. So with this being a pre-composition, I'm now going to start to build my scene. I'm going to create two background solids. One is the actual background, and one which the use will become apparent when we start working within 3D. So I'll go Layer, New Solid, I'll create my background. I'm going to create a second solid as well, of a darker colour. Before I go any further, let's explore what 3D layers are and how they function. Now I've created a second layer here, this star shape, and I'm going to use this and our tidy man pre-comp within a 3D space to show how it works. We have to start by telling a layer that it is a 3D layer. Once it is a 3D layer, it will ignore the layer order and will be defined by three-dimensional space what is in front and what is behind. So to turn a layer 3D, down in the layers where our motion blur options are, you see this little three-dimensional cube. We're going to turn that on for the layers we want to affect. When a layer is 3D, you'll see that its anchor point now has three arrows. An X, a Y, and a Z. X is horizontal movement. Y is vertical movement. And Z is depth. As we move things forward and back in the Z dimension, they will move in front or behind other assets depending on where they are within that three-dimensional space. If I, for example, push this star forwards, it will get larger as it comes closer to the virtual camera. If I push it backwards, it will get smaller as it goes further away from the virtual camera, as we would expect as it works within a normal kind of perspective. With our 3D space, we can also move our virtual camera. The camera tools can be found up here. Orbit lets us pivot and rotate around. Track X and Y moves the camera horizontally and vertically, and Track Z moves the camera forwards and backwards. I'm going to select my Orbit tool. But when I try and use it, you'll notice it won't do anything. That's because we haven't created a virtual camera yet. Once we create the virtual camera, we can move it also through the three-dimensional space and see its point of view. So let's create a camera. We go to the Layer drop-down menu, New, Camera. Here we get various options. We can choose its focal length, its zoom, various options to do with its aperture, as it's simulating a real-world physical camera. For now, the standard options will be absolutely fine. We will tick off enable depth of field if that is turned on, and that way everything will be nice and sharp. We'll click OK. We're going to have a camera in our composition, and if I take my orbit tool now, I can look around in perspective, and as I move around, I'm able to pivot and have the objects move within perspective. You'll also see that perspective, these objects are perfectly flat. So it's like we're looking at it on its kind of oblique edge, like holding a piece of paper at an angle to us. So this is very much like placing a camera in the real physical world and pointing it to create the composition that you want in your final scene. Let's play that through. So we can see Tidy Man throwing the rubbish and it going into the bin. And even already, this gives us all kinds of options and possibilities. We can place text elements or graphic elements in different places in three-dimensional space and move the camera. As you can see, the camera has position data, which means we can keyframe it. I could keyframe the camera's position and orientation, for example, to allow me to create dynamic camera movement as well. So already we're creating much more visually interesting shots as we're revealing the target of Tidy Man's rubbish throw, as opposed to seeing everything at the same time. But there is a lot more we can do when working within a 3D space. Let's look at how we can add lights to create shadow and tone within our images. For a start, I need something for that shadow to land on, and for this I'm going to create a floor. And this is why I created a second solid. I'm going to create another 3D layer from the darker solid, and it is now a three-dimensional object within that space. I'm going to rotate it on its x-axis. (90 degrees, which I can just type in. And I'm going to move it down so it's just touching the points of Tidy Man's end of his legs. And I'm going to scale that up until it's pretty big. So I now have a floor and a horizon line. To create shadows, I need to add lights. Currently, we have a global light. Basically, everything is exposed exactly the same. Light is everywhere and hits every object evenly. But that doesn't happen in nature. There's shadow and occlusion, so let's try and create those kind of effects by adding a light. We can add a light by going to our Layer drop-down menu, New, Light. And we have a variety of options. We have different light types: parallel, spot, point, and ambient. Parallel is like a strip of light, akin to a fluorescent bulb. A spotlight is like a torch. A point of light is like a candle that illuminates light in every direction. An ambient light is how I described just there, where light is everywhere and exposes every surface evenly. Ambient light is the only light that also does not cast a shadow. I'm going to take a point of light. I'm going to give it an intensity. Once I go over 100%, we start to overexpose our image. And I'm going to ensure Casts Shadows is ticked on. I can change the color of my light. I can have it as a pure white, for example, or I can add a slight tint to it. I'm going to give a slight yellow warmth to that light. Click OK. So now I have my light up here. So now I have my light up here, and as I move it around, what I can see is being exposed by that light. If something is dark, it means the light isn't falling upon it. So I can put a light behind something and backlight it, or I can place it in front of an object. The further away from a surface, the larger the pool of light, exactly as you expect of a torch, but the duller that fall will be. If I double click on the light in my layers, the options will come back up and I can, for example, increase that intensity and have a look at how it's going to kind of affect my composition. But you will notice there's still no shadow being caused by our tidy man. That is because, as you'll no doubt have guessed, because we haven't turned shadows on for our asset. To change your shadow options, go to the layers and open up the asset you want to affect, and you'll notice now it has material options because it's a 3D layer. This is where we're able to change how it reacts to light. We have cast shadows off, on and only. We have accept shadows and lights. So for example, if I tell it that it doesn't accept a light, it will be flat exposed. If I say accept shadows, a shadow can be cast onto that object. If I say off, then no shadow can be seen on that object. And only, the object is invisible, but all we can see is the shadows that are landing on its surface. So I'm going to have shadows on, and accept lights on, and cast shadows on. And you'll notice as I change these options, the shadows underneath it and what's visible from the object change as well. And obviously where that light is in relation to that object will change that shadow as well. It's very rare that you only have a single light within a scene, so I'm going to add a second light. This time I'm going to add a spotlight. And I'm going to make it a slightly different color. And you can see now I have this pool of light that I can move around and I can drag and point. So I'm going to point it at the bin. So as we track the rubber ship over to the bin, we have a nice spotlight illuminating our scene where the bin is. I think at this point I don't need this shape layer, so I'm just going to hide that. The last thing I'm going to do with this composition before I play with depth of field is I'm going to address this hard edge of the horizon line here. I want to soften that. I'm going to do that with a feather. I'm going to create that feather with a mask. Just take a mask tool, select the solid, and drag the mask out. I'm going to drag the anchor points of the mask out to give my horizon line. Then in my mask options for that layer, I'll see feather. As I increase that number, not too high. So with a little feather there, that now softens the edge for the background. Takes a bit of visual interest and texture as we move through the animation, revealing the rubbish bin in its little pool of spotlight. So now we have our composition in a 3D space. The camera's moving, there's motion blur, all the animation's there. But there's something that we can add to this to bring it to the next level. And it is depth of field. Now we have a virtual camera, and therefore it's depth of field in the exact same way that we can with a physical camera. Therefore we're able to focus on a single object and everything in front of and behind that object will become more and more blurred the further away that gets from the camera. To create depth of field within your composition is a pretty straightforward process. However, it is used best when we then keyframe that depth of field so the point of focus changes over time, especially when the camera itself moves. This form of virtual focus pulling allows us to cue the eye of the viewer into what is important not only with composition, but with focus as well, by blurring out extraneous details or things that aren't the most important element within a composition. So in this example, we're going to start off focusing on the tidy man, then the focus is going to follow that rubbish, ending on the bin with the character of tidy man being blurred at the end. So let's get to it. I'm going to turn my composition to full preview so that I can see a nice sharp edge. This will slow down my rendering times, so we'll just have to kind of pick and choose where we're looking at for a reference for our focus. To turn on depth of field and make any changes to it, we're going to double click on the camera, and we'll be presented with the same camera settings pop-up box that we had when we created the camera in the first instance. We're going to start by enabling depth of field. We're going to have lots of other options now available to us, such as focus distance, most crucially, as well as aperture and blur level. Now the focus distance is measured in millimeters, and the further away from that point of focus you are, backwards or forwards, the more blurred an object will become. However, that blur level is going to be pretty weak to begin with, so I'm going to push this blur level number up. And as I do so, we'll see the background blur more or less depending on where we settle our blur level. I'm going to put this at about 400 to begin with. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change my focus distance. It is measured in millimeters, so this can be quite ephemeral sometimes. So I'm going to push it forward, give it time to render up, and I'll see that that's not exactly perfectly sharp. I can pull it closer, and you see it blurs so strongly that we're not able to see anything at all. I'm going to bring it in until our tidy man itself is nice and crisp. Zooming in sometimes can really help with this, as we're able to see those fine changes on the hard edge of things. So that's quite soft there. Bring that back up to just over 200, bit sharper. Probably about there. Bearing in mind that as we zoom over 100%, there'll be a natural softness to it anyway. I'll then click OK to commit those changes. As I scrub through my footage, you'll now see as we get towards the end of the shot, the bin has a bit of softness to it, but Tidy Man himself being further away is significantly more blurred. That's giving us the effect that we want. However, the bin needs to be more focused than that. So this is where keyframing comes in. I need the focus distance to change from the start to the end of the clip so that what is the key object within the scene that I want the viewer's eye to follow is the sharpest object, the thing that is in focus. This happens all the time in live action film and television, and we're just going to simulate that focus pulling within After Effects using keyframes. I'm going to scrub through to the point where I want this to be nice and sharp, and when the camera begins to move. I'm going to open up my layers and the camera options, and I will find focus distance. I'm going to turn that on. Now frustratingly, you'll notice that it measures in pixels here and millimeters when we open up the camera settings, so the numbers can become quite ephemeral. And I'm going to scroll forward to where the camera stops moving, open up my camera settings, and adjust my focus distance in the exact same way, incrementally until I find a point where I'm happy with the focus. Again, I may zoom in to help me with this to make sure that I'm getting it as sharp as it can be. And see, because we're looking at the bin obliquely, one side is softer than the other. So it's about choosing the portion of the bin I want to be sharpest. And for us, that is going to be the portion of the bin that the rubbish enters into. So this kind of leading edge here. And I'm going to click OK. And you'll notice I have two keyframes. I might just reposition that to keep the sharpness here. As we move in, we're going to change the movement keyframes of the bin as well, just so that the movement stops around about the time that the rubbish enters the bin. It's kind of fine tuning you'll constantly do with your composition, so you're constantly assessing whether the movement is right and the elements are correctly placed at the correct point in time. So now let's render that through and have a look. And there's our finished shot. So that's how we use 3D layers within After Effects. We've turned some 2D pre-comps into 3D. We've added a bit of animation and motion blur, some camera movement, and finished it off with a little bit of depth of field to really finish the shot. Hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you in the next one.